Alrighty, welcome back to another session on MTGO. Since we have not yet sit together to play in paper, Samuel and me, we will do that soon. I was starting a league on MTGO with my Emry, and in the very first round I already faced one of the other new unbanned commanders, which is Winota. Facing the player quite regularly whenever we are joining MTGO leagues, so always end up in very interesting battles. So was this one, I thought. Yeah, my starting hand was okay. Meekstone is not the craziest card against Winota, since usually, depending on the setup, your opponent has a couple of non-humans on board, and then there is like one or a maximum of 2 swings with the creatures, and then you're already dead. And the tiny ones are always 2 or 1 power. Nonetheless, I kept this hand because I thought there might be some value in bringing down the Copper Cannoneer early on. And both Tezzerets can find me some combo pieces eventually, or maybe some stacks pieces to stall. My first Emry cast mills a flute, which is quite good. Here I decided to go for the Cannoneer first to have like a big creature. And at that point, the Meekstone is quite awkward because it only allows me to attack once with the Cannoneer. But in this case, I just keep it on board and block the All-Slot Pride, or at least deny the Pride from bringing down more cats. So yeah, most likely the best line here is to recast Emry for 2 and then just give her 1 even, because we have 4 artifacts on board. And then I give her haste with the Lava Spur Boots, and then I can cast the flute in order to delay the Winota cast. Maybe get to a point to search some relevant cards with either of the Tezzerets, or also try to win the game with the Copper Cannoneer. Let's see. Definitely an interesting dynamic. My list doesn't play too much counter magic. I also don't run Paradox Engine. Other people do that, as I've heard. So yeah, I'm coming from Oswald. I said that in the deck tech already for our members, that I felt, I mean, Oswald is maybe a bad comparison, but the card and the combos around it felt quite clunky. Then again, here you really don't need that much to bring it up, to be fair, so might give it a try in the future. For now, I'm happy with how the list works. As I said, flute coming down to prevent Winota from being cast, and then there's a Flage that deals with Emry, but honestly, it's not a big deal because my opponent destroyed Emry twice, and she costs still only 2, since I have 5 artifacts on field. So I actually milled an Arcbound Ravager, and that's an interesting combo together with Copper Cannoneer if I have enough artifacts on board. So first, it gives me the option to sacrifice a Meekstone. That is useless so far. And second, if I have enough artifacts, I can just sacrifice everything into the Arcbound Ravager, and then sacrifice the Ravager itself to transfer all the tokens, the counters over to the Cannoneer. And then I might have like a pretty big attack here, always considering, you know, now my opponent is tapped out. Is there any stacks artifact that I can pull up in order to gain an advantage? But Tanglewire doesn't do anything here. Winter Orb would just lock me out of the game, I guess, because my opponent has, for now, the better attack, and I really need to bring down the Ravager in order to get rid of the Meekstone, I think. So that's what I went for. White thing to have a hasty Emry all over again. Other lists also play the Lightning Greaves, which I currently do not do. There are more options, more tutor options to find the Lava Spur Boots in comparison to the Greaves. And since I play the Mirren Spy combo, I decided to not do it. I feel like the deck has 120 cards and it's already hard to make some cuts. So yeah. It is in progress. My opponent goes in with a couple of creatures. The Phoenix Chick comes back. That's a card that we haven't seen for quite some time. I think Red Deck Wins played it every now and then back then when burn strategy was still a valid thing to do in Duel Commander. Now I can sacrifice the Meekstone to trade, or at least kill one of those tokens and reduce the damage slightly. Right now I have 2, 4. So I could sacrifice 3 more artifacts into the Ravager, would be at 5. Recasting Welding Jar would be 6, 7 plus for the in addition to the trigger for the Kappa Cannoneer. So it would be at 14, which is not enough. World Map makes it 16, still not enough. So what I can do here is just recast the Bauble and probably bring down Tezzeret to get Static Orb. Because right now my opponent would only untap, can decide whether or not to untap the lands or the creatures. But this way there's not enough pressure to kill me next turn, and my Kappa Cannoneer will most likely do that. So next turn I can just decide to untap a land, untap the Cannoneer, or untap Cannoneer, untap Emry, and then recast the Bauble. And here we'll go for the Static Orb. And yeah, my opponent realizes, well, probably not getting out of that anymore. So there is a concession coming in soon. I'm not too sure about the deck suit yet. Mostly about Meekstone. It's one of my pet cards, to be honest. But yeah, I just wanted to give it a try. I think it's an okay fit here, and it helps against some matchups, but probably not against a critical matchup. So this might be one of the cards that ends up in sideboard again. My opponent on the play. Skrelv is a worthy target for the Mental Misstep. Scene of the Crime is another card that I feel is okay. But sometimes it really sucks that it comes on tapped. Then again, sometimes you have like triggers for the Cannoneer. You have more affinity count or a higher affinity count. These are the upsides. And I think I corrected one so far to draw a card even, which is pretty bad. You can't replay it from the from the graveyard with your commander actually. Here in this case, it grants me an Emry on turn 2. And I have an okay flip. Welding Jar doesn't do much here. And the Crypt and a Soulguide Lantern are pretty much useless against my opponent. Here, a very well-placed Crystal Vein. That's a good example for on the play versus on the draw. If it wasn't for that, I would have Mana Sculpt or Sink into Stupor. Mana Sculpt, by the way, is a counterspell that I was trying out since we're playing a wizard in a command zone. However, I'm not quite sure if I want to keep it. If you play it in Baral or Ral, it always costs 2. Then it's a better counterspell for sure, but paying 3 all the time is not really what you want to do in this deck. So yes, I did manage to get some mana off of it. Yesterday I played again against Reanimator when my opponent was hardcasting something big, and then you have like a really good time with this counter, but overall I think it's just too clunky. My opponent also has quite a good hit here with Eomer. I have to bounce that and hope to find something. I mean, I can still find the Meekstone in combination with the Tangle Wire. That would not be too bad. Talia does hurt, so my Archway comes down tapped. But the Tangle Wire in itself doesn't do the job. And the Bay is not what I was searching for, so we will go over to game 3. Interesting dynamics so far. Pretty fast matchups. And that's a snap keep. I have Urza, I have an Arcane Signet, Surveillance Cam. If I have the Grinding Station, then I have a direct combo in combination with Emry. I can always tap the Surveillance Camera for 1 blue, sacrifice it to the Grinding Station, mill my opponent, and recast it with Emry. But apart from that, this hand is already pretty good. Even if Urza would not survive, I have the Cannoneer again, and my flip is also not too bad. I mean, Winter Moon isn't the best orb against this deck, but it's okay. Not like Winota plays 40 basic lands, as we can see here. So I can play that to delay things a little bit. And especially Urza gives me a very big boost here in terms of mana. Drawing the bauble is even better. Yeah, I'm gonna go for the bauble cast first, just in case something happens, so I can make additional mana to cast the Winter Moon. For example, if my opponent would have a Solitude or something up in response to the token. That's important. It's always a bit annoying to use Urza's ability here on MTGO because you have to separately click on each artifact. But it makes sense because the activated ability comes from Urza and it's not granted to all the artifacts, so that's the way the card works. And I'm feeling quite fine here, to be honest. I have the Surveillance Cam to tap down the Goblin if my opponent decides to run in, which is quite unlikely, into a 5/5 construct token. But I can keep it for a later turn. With Winota, here is a Selfless Spirit, another card that we haven't seen for ages. It was a substantial card for White Weenie and even Boros decks back then. I would say 3 or 4 years ago. These days, it's just not what a 2-drop has to do. So I draw another of those good blue cards. Wrong. Currently, I have affinity 4. So I have to bring down the Medallion, which reduces its cost by 2. But I'd rather bring down the Kappa Cannoneer first. I was just thinking about... I mean, I could have done that differently. I could have, instead of bringing the bauble first, I should have maybe cast the Cannoneer and tap the Cannoneer to recast the bauble to get more triggers on the Cannoneer. Then again, I wanted to have it on board as a potential blocker if my opponent cheats in Winota next turn, and it's possible. There is Simian Spirit Guide, City of Traitors, and the Crystal Vein. So it's not too unlikely that Winota comes down, and I have no counter magic for that, so I want to have some blockers. While also pressuring a little bit with the Construct token. Because I don't have too much time against this deck, and yeah, I feel like if I find the right card next turn, again, going for the Ravager, for example, with the Cannoneer, then I might be able to win a game. And what do we see? As I said, there is a Crystal Vein, okay. So we have another Winota coming down the way. I think it's okay to cast the Surveillance Cam here. Gives my opponent 1 trigger less. This is the wrong target to tap down. I should have tapped down the Spirit. Because if the Goblin is attacking, I can just block it with Urza. But it doesn't matter because my opponent has a Reverent Mantra. And the camera is a blue artifact. So I can't even block with Urza here. 2 triggers down the line. Let's see what my opponent brings down. Blade Splicer is not too crazy, to be honest. Attacks for 1, brings a 3/3 token. But that's a good blocker for my construct. Eomer is much better. Comes down as a 4/4, directly kills my Urza. And that's a bit scary here, to be honest, because with Urza on board, I have so much mana. I can just play Krang next turn and refuel. I could even activate the Surveillance Cam to loop it with Emry, but I would most likely go for more draws in order to find something to win the game. Yeah, and it's quite clear that I only have one more round to play. Otherwise, doesn't look too good for me. Let's see. Net Assist is one of those cards that probably doesn't fit the strategy here, since it doesn't have any evasion. Just a big thing, just a big, or a second construct token, a rather costly construct token, to be honest. I might end up cutting this one. So, casting Krang, hoping to find something. At that point, without Urza, I don't have enough mana to go for Artifact Tutor into Ravager, unless I find a Transmute Artifact and a land. So drawing 3 cards here. And none of those cards does the job, apart from Mirren Spy. So what I can do is, I will crack the bauble to maybe find another land. But the Mirren Spy is a combo in itself here. So usually what I could do is draw my entire library in my opponent's upkeep. Here I have just repeated triggers for the Cannoneer, and then it grows to 12 or more than that for a lethal attack. You would most likely stack it up to 15, 16, something like this. My opponent could have... There is no Solitude. If there would be a Solitude, my opponent would most likely handle the Mirren Spy immediately. But if there is some random life gain, you have to take that into consideration. That's it. Lucky me drawing the Mirren Spy. Pretty cool game. I hope you enjoyed it. And we will see each other in the next session. Bye-bye.